So what I would like to do today is actually to propose a different, what I take to be a different interpretation of De Finetti. It goes back to the foundation were in the MA, and what I would like to convince you that if you take De Finetti as an instrumentalist about probability, his philosophy of probability makes much better sense, and you might even consider actually joining his camp and being a follower. I'm saying that because De Finetti was extreme, as we shall see. I mean, he was extreme in saying that probability is only subjective and there is no objective probability. And that, I think, encouraged people to have the misconception about his philosophy and about different aspects of his philosophy. So hopefully, I mean, I will manage to explain this and to convince you. So this is De Finetti. He actually started to write in the mid-20s when he was a BA student, and he wrote until 1982 or more. I mean, it's like enormous number of papers and amazing, I mean, corpus. So I will start with the background and motivation, and then I will present my understanding of De Finetti, the highlights that I take of De Finetti's theory of probability, emphasizing that what unified the different aspects is the instrumentalist viewpoint. And then, in light of that, I will talk about some misconceptions that I think there are about instrumentalism, and therefore, like certain attitudes toward it or certain interpretation of it. And I think that De Finetti, actually analyzing De Finetti, helps to show what is maybe wrong about the conception of instrumentalism and the debate between the realist and instrumentalist. So the background. De Finetti was one of the founding fathers of modern subjective probability. Usually he and Ramsey are considered, I mean, like the most important, maybe, founding fathers. He's one of the radical people in this camp because he thinks that probability is subjective and that objective probability doesn't make sense. So he denies the existence of objective probabilities. For him, probabilities are mediated, coherent subjective opinions that reflect ignorance. And subjective probabilities are not guesses or predictions about unknown objective probabilities. They are subjective opinions that are intended to be instrumental for action. So basically, they are guide of life. Now, the theory has been very influential, and actually more and more, like more and more people, I mean, in the philosophy of, in statistical inference are following De Finetti, or the subjective and the Bayesian school. But there are like objection, and two of the main objection. One is, actually you can read it in the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on probability, that it's basically anything goes in De Finetti's view, because it's subjective and all you need is coherence. So any subjective degree of belief that is coherent, any degree of belief that coherence are permissive as probabilities. So I would like to argue that that's when you read De Finetti, actually it couldn't be as farther than that. And also, De Finetti is considered as giving an operational definition of degrees of belief, and therefore of probability, behaviorist operational, and therefore the argument is, the claim is that, because the claim is that degrees of belief are defined in terms of betting behaviors or disposition to behave, and then the argument is that the theory inherent, therefore all the objection, and there are many of them, to operationalism and behaviorism. So two of the main aim of the paper is one, that to argue that these objections are unfounded, and actually they overlook various aspects, important aspects of De Finetti's philosophy of probability. And the second one is actually to try to present De Finetti philosophy of probability as instrumentalist, and to try to show how these important aspects of the theory that have been neglected could fit well within this instrumentalist philosophy of probability. Okay. So I will talk about, we talk only a little bit at the end about the application of De Finetti to quantum mechanics, but this is mainly philosophy of probability talk. So I will start to talk about De Finetti's view that is against the way that probability theory is taught, against the idea that you start with a formal theory and then you need interpretation. So De Finetti, you have to start with the concept of probability and then derive actually the theory itself. So it's the other way around. So, and then I will talk about the subjective aspect of the theory, try to explain it, and then connect it to the instrumental part of the theory, why subjective and instrumental are tightly connected, and also talk about something that is totally neglected in the discussion of De Finetti, is the role of intuition. De Finetti actually thought that intuition, psycho-intuitive capacities of human are very important for the subjective theory of probability. Then I will talk about measurements and operationalism, try to convince you that De Finetti doesn't have an operationalist definition of degrees of belief, and therefore it doesn't actually suffer all the bad consequences or implication of this theory. And finally, I will propose interpretation of coherence. I will argue that coherence actually, De Finetti concept of coherence was not well understood, and some very important aspect of it that is related to verificationism and the instrumental character was neglected. And once you take it into account, you get in De Finetti a non-classical probability theory. So it's different from the way it is presented. It's not quantum, but it's non-classical in some sense. So the structure, the logical structure of probabilities is different from the way it is presented usually. So that's the menu for today. Hopefully you can get through it. Okay, so probability axioms are not arbitrary convention. And so, as I mentioned, I mean, it is typical. That's the way I studied probability theory, being an engineer. I mean, and then studying like natural sciences and then social sciences, economics. I mean, you study probability as a formal theory. Sometimes the TA gives some paradoxes, I mean, in order to, for half a class. And then the TA gets into trouble with the philosophy and then immediately run back to, he or she, I mean, run back to talk about the formalism. And then once people start to do philosophy of probability, they start to talk about the interpretation. So for De Finetti, the interpretation and the conceptual issues start right at the beginning. He objected this view, and he said probability theory is not merely a formal, merely arbitrary construction, and its axiom cannot be chosen freely as convention justified only by mathematical elegance or convenience. They should express what is necessarily inherent in the notion of probability and nothing more. So that's basically what De Finetti is trying to do. And for instance, I mean, one of the ideas that has not actually been adopted by the community that follow De Finetti or follow Bayesianism is the definition of conditional probability that is not the standard conditional probability for De Finetti. Once you look at his philosophy, it's more like a conditional with probabilistic consequence or something like that. Not standard one, but anyway, I mean, but this all follows from thinking about what probability is as a concept. So De Finetti thought of probability as a guide of life under uncertainty, and being guide obviously is tightly related to decision under uncertainty. So it's always, the discussion is in some decision theoretic framework, either the betting or those of you who heard the loss function, or De Finetti considered a few different ones. And he thought about that probability should be rational degrees of belief, and he thought about coherence as a necessary condition. It's actually, as we should see, usually De Finetti is introduced as like that coherence is necessary and sufficient, but as we should see, actually, De Finetti has to say more. You need more than coherence for probabilities to be rational, for degrees of belief to be rational. Okay, and what we know from De Finetti is like that he argues that from the coherence of degrees of belief, one can derive all the theorems of probability theory. Okay, so that's about, very briefly, about his general conception of the notion of probability. We will see some other aspects, as we go along, especially when we talk about the instrumental aspect and the intuition, the role of intuition. So probabilities are coherent degrees of beliefs, and the main argument for coherence is that action that are sanctioned by incoherent degrees of belief lead to undesirable consequences, come what may. So one should avoid them. And so coherence, or coherent degrees of belief are widely considered as a necessary condition for rational degrees of belief, but many think that one needs more than just coherent degrees of belief. One needs to constrain subjective probability by objective facts, and especially by objective probabilities. And as many of you probably, heard about David Lewis' principal, but the principle of direct inference from objective probability to subjective probability have been around for a long time. People like Ian Hacking, introduced, explicitly in his logic of statistical inference, and they were around, even before. He actually talks about it as like it's known, around. It's not news. De Finetti rejected this view. For him, probabilities and probabilistic reasoning are always understood as subjective, and they merely arise because of uncertainty. Yeah.
Did he ever comment directly on Lewis's principle, or is it rather that he would reject this view because of?
He would reject, this view. He never.
I'm quite sure he would.
Yeah.
But did he ever comment directly?
I don't know.
Lewis?
I don't know. I think it was too late, probably.
Okay.
Yeah, but he would reject, and I think that also, sometimes when people present, De Finetti's theorem, it's misleading. So for De Finetti, it's only subjective. There is no objective probability. It doesn't make sense. He actually argues, not all the arguments are compelling, but he argues in a number of places against objective probabilities. Interpretation. And so he thought that they do not make sense, and the objective interpretation of probability, and sometimes he used really strong words. For instance, the abandonment of superstitious belief about the existence of phlogiston, the cosmic at absolute space and time, or fairies and witches, was an essential step along the road to scientific thinking. Probability, too, if regarded as something endowed with some kind of objective existence, is no less misleading misconception, an illusory attempt to exteriorize or materialize our actual probabilistic beliefs. The actual is because actually the translation is wrong. They write true rather than actual, but in Italian, it's the same word. So it doesn't make sense for him to talk about true probabilistic. Anyway, these are strong words, and this is what he believed. I mean, not everybody will buy it, but that's his view. Okay, so De Finetti thought that no fact could prove or disprove a belief or degree of belief, but facts could influence a degree of belief, sorry. Facts could influence beliefs and degrees of beliefs. So belief revision would always govern by a mathematical rule, would not be governed by a mechanical rule. It is in each case my personal judgment that is responsible for giving a weight to the facts. So De Finetti is always against mechanical rules. I mean, it's interesting that sometimes people actually take his philosophy to have, I mean, conditionalization, but he's always against that. For him, the idea of subjective is that you always make decisions. It's a normative theory, and it's opinion, and it has to be a meditated opinion. That doesn't mean that there is no psychological influence of facts on degrees of belief. There could be, and there are, and there are influences. And he says, I find no difficulties in admitting that any form of comparison between probability evaluation of myself or other people and actual events may be an element influencing my further judgment of the same status as any other kind of information. But as with any other experience, this modification would not be governed by a mechanical rule. It is, in each case, my personal judgment that is responsible for giving a weight to the fact. For instance, according to my feeling about the success of the other person being due to his skill and competence or merely due to a meaningless chance. So it's always, I mean, there is each point is not that one doesn't take facts, objective facts into account, but there is always a subjective decision, how much weight to give them and how to evaluate them. Now, as I mentioned, the common view, and that's from the Stanford Encyclopedia, De Finetti radical subjectivism is unacceptable because it sanctions a permissive epistemology licensing doxastic states that we would normally call crazy. Anyway, the idea is like that it's anything goes, basically, with De Finetti because he's subjectivist.
What are doxastic? What are they?
Yeah. Yeah, belief state. It's not important, I mean, yeah. It's the idea is like that basically it's unconstrained. That's the idea. The common view is unwarranted for at least two reasons. One, it doesn't distinguish between the ontological status of probability in the Finetti theory and the way they are to be assigned or evaluated. That's actually, I mean, a common misconception about instrumentalism. It's conflation of the ontological status with the reasoning that goes into, I mean, science. And the second one, it's, I think it overlooks or misconstrues, I mean, De Finetti instrumentalist philosophy of probability. Once you take both into account, you see that De Finetti actually thought that not anything goes. The reasoning should be very rigorous, I mean, in determining probabilities. Okay, so we are coming to talk about that. Okay, so my argument is that that De Finetti was instrumentalist about probability, and we try to present his theory with all the aspects that are related, all the main aspects that are related to the instrumentalist philosophy. So probability is purely instrumental, and its value should be determined solely on the basis of its potential to serve as guide for action under uncertainty, which means guide for action means also scientific reasoning. So like which theory we choose and which probability we choose on the basis of competing theories and so on. Was he instrumentalist about scientific theories? In his philosophical lectures, he says the following. He says, if one takes science seriously, then one always considers it also as an instrument. The editor of the lectures thought that the also here makes De Finetti moderate instrumentalist. I don't know what is a moderate instrumentalist. I think either you are instrumentalist or you are not. And if you are not, if you are instrumentalist, moderation is not. It's maybe because of misconception about instrumentalism that people talk about moderation and extremists. But in my view, one way to read it is like that De Finetti sees that it follows from taking science seriously that you have to take an instrumental point of view. And other things that he says, I mean, seems to support it. So, for instance, he says that it's definitely better to, if you have statistical mechanics, to follow statistical mechanics rather than other views in determining probabilities or the basis for subjective rational opinions. But he said that, that the so-called probabilistic laws of nature, he saw them as instrumental rules. By looking at the outcome of a phenomenon, we could be driven to formulate a rule by virtue of which, in each case, things would blend in that way as if it were a necessary law of nature. So basically, it seems that he supports, you can talk about laws of nature, provided that you think about it along the instrumentalist philosophy. And De Finetti says also another reason to think that he's instrumentalist. He's again in the philosophical lecture that he gives, I think, in the 70s, but they were only published in the 2001 in Italian, I think, and 2008 in English. So he said, speaking of empirical tests in the field of probability is contradiction in terms. So he doesn't think that you can actually falsify probabilistic theories. And that again seems to support, I mean, the instrumentalist reading. But obviously he thinks that you can prefer one theory to another because one theory can be more instrumental, can do more work for you than another. Not because the other one is false or any of them is true, because they are instruments anyway. He also objected to the idea that, to the realist view that theories are approximately true. And this is a quotation from his lecture. He has an exchange with some of the people that audit the course. If we knew where the truth was, we would not go close to it, we would go straight there. And if we don't know where it is, we cannot even know how far it is from us. So basically, I mean, he doesn't think very highly, I mean, about this way of thinking. So obviously, being instrumentalist, De Finetti thought that subjective probability can be a guide in science in everyday life, independently of one's metaphysical views about, and that's what he says, probabilistic reasoning is completely unrelated to general philosophical controversies, such as determinism versus indeterminism, realism versus solipsism, and so on. So his view is like that the instrumental value or the instrumental potential of probability is independent on the metaphysical view, of metaphysical views. Okay. The next thing that is very important, and I think that is like the role of intuition and how actually one has to determine probabilities, subjective probabilities. So De Finetti thought that evaluating or assigning probability is an inductive reasoning. And being inductive reasoning, it has to be rigorous. To speak about inductive reasoning means, however, to attribute a certain validity to that mode of learning, to consider it not as a result of a capricious psychological reaction, but as mental process susceptible of an analysis, interpretation, and justification. And so De Finetti talks, about and warn about different kinds of superficial way of evaluating probabilities, and he warns against them. So, for instance, examples. He warns especially against two common patterns of what he calls superficial way of thinking. On the one hand, you may think that the choice being subjective and therefore arbitrary does not require too much of an effort in pinpointing one particular value rather than different one. So De Finetti rejected this view. The determining probability has to be rigorous inductive reasoning, and therefore one has to take it seriously, and as usually we expect from inductive reasoning, good inductive reasoning. On the other hand, it might be thought that no mental effort is required since it can be avoided by the mechanical application of some standardized procedure. And again, De Finetti rejected that. So basically, the evaluation of probability is a judgment and a kind of decision, in a sense. And it has to be taken very seriously and use, whatever we use usually in inductive reasoning. Now, De Finetti's philosophy of probability presupposes that people have intuitive faculties to form reasonable opinions about things that they are uncertain about. And with the aid of probability theory, the capacity to form reasonable probabilities, subjective probabilities. So this is a presupposition that he has, and for him, as we shall see in a moment, intuition is really important. He held that people need to develop and refine these faculties, these psycho-intuitive faculties, and apply reason to learn to guard them against the tendency to form superficial probabilistic opinion. So, for instance, it's well known that in his classes, he would encourage students, to bet on football games in Serie A in order to ensure that learning from experience is actually becoming better and better. Unfortunately, it wasn't documented in any paper, I think, or maybe he talks in one of the paper, but not actually the results of this. But it might be in his actually archive. Yet, he cautioned against misunderstanding of the relation between intuition and reason. What he called reason is more like coherence or logical thinking. And that's what he says. The tendency to overestimate reason, often in an exclusive spirit, is particularly harmful. Reason, to my mind, is invaluable as a supplement to the other psycho-intuitive faculties, but never a substitute for them. Figuratively, reason is a pole that may keep the plant of intuitive thought from growing crooked, but it is not itself either a plant or a valid substitute for a plant. So basically, all these things that people talk about coherent as the only relevant, for De Finetti, the intuitive ability, that we have these intuitive capacities that we should train and perfect, they are invaluable, they are very important, and without them, his whole theory of probability, collapses basically. Now, it's tempting to object that, De Finetti's theory is based on the assumption that, presupposition that the efficacy of, the presupposition that human intuition are effective in determining instrumental probabilities. And we know that intuition are frequently deceptive. This seemed to provide some ammunition to the realist in the arguments against the instrumentalist. But I think that realists have also to appeal to intuition, in judgments, because, judging which theory is more explanatory or which theory is more promising, one needs intuition. So I don't think that any camp could actually gain anything from or lose from the assumption of intuition. So I think that the objection to intuition are usually, based on misconception of what these intuitions are. Cannot talk about it much, and he doesn't say so much about this. But I think that, in my view, whether you want to take, De Finetti's theory, it seems to me very powerful what he says here and correct that intuition is very important. Okay. So just to sum up so far, we see that De Finetti, not anything goes. Determining probabilities is a serious inductive process that has to be done in a rigorous way and has to be learned. One has to learn how to avoid certain mistakes and certain wrong way of thinking. And the argument is that the ontological status of probabilities doesn't reflect on the instrumental value. So the fact that the probabilities are subjective doesn't mean that they cannot be valuable as instrument. Okay, so now I'm turning to talk about the objection that De Finetti's theory is operational and behaviorist. So De Finetti commonly conceived as giving an operational behaviorist definition of degrees of belief and accordingly probability, because, as we said, probabilities are coherent degrees of beliefs. The ideas are that degrees of belief are defined in terms of betting. So you give people, betting situation, scenarios, either actual or hypothetical, and according to the betting, you find out what are the degrees of belief. So the degrees of belief are actually created and defined by this betting situation, according to this argument. And there are a number of people that actually argue that. Gillis, Erickson, and Hayek in a very interesting paper on what are degrees of beliefs, and then Hayek again. Now, De Finetti assigned a very great importance to the measurement of degrees of belief. And because he thought that any concept that is important in order to be effective in, especially probability in this case, as a guide of life, we have to be able to measure, at least in principle. So since degrees of belief are very important, at least in principle, we should be able, to measure them. So, and he said that in order to give an effective meaning to a notion, and not only in appearance of such in a metaphysical verbalistic sense, an operational definition is required. You can see, the influence of positivism on De Finetti. When he wrote, he was and he talks about like the operational definition of Einstein, for instance. The simultaneity, was very impressed by that, but De Finetti doesn't mean actually really operational definition. What he means by operational definition, a definition based on a criterion which allows us to measure it. So it's not that degrees of belief are actually defined in operation. What is important, that will be a way to measure them. And for De Finetti, what enables measuring degrees of belief is the relation between action and opinions. So he held that what enables us to measure subjective probability is the relation between decision of individual, which are observable. You see action, one decides to go to the supermarket or or not to go, and their opinions, i.e. probabilities, which are not directly observable. So first of all, I mean, degrees of belief are not defined in operation because they are opinions, they are judgments, opinion and judgments. So they are something that, but by the fact that probability is discussed and explicated in a decision theoretic framework, one can connect the opinion, which are not defined operationally, to some actions and therefore measure them in ideal situation. Obviously, there are a lot of complication in measuring degrees of belief, and De Finetti talks about it. I mean, part of his theory actually geared toward trying to minimize the problems in measuring degrees of beliefs. So this suggests that De Finetti saw the betting decision theoretic framework as a method of measuring degrees of belief, not defining them. So I don't think that the operationalist argument is right. And actually, Erickson and Hayek themselves point out another reason why, a couple of reasons why we shouldn't think about De Finetti as operationalist, defining degrees of belief as operationalist, because De Finetti was worried that a nonlinear relation between utility and money and the extent to which people care about the bets may render the betting framework inadequate for measuring degrees of belief. And as Erickson and Hayek rightly point out, these worries make no sense if degrees of belief are defined operationally. Because if they're defined operationally, what you do in the operation, that's the definition. I mean, you just have to decide different operations, but I mean, once you get the operation, that's the definition. And obviously, that's what was not De Finetti. So I don't think that, I mean, he's right to say that he's operationalist or behaviorist. I mean, I think he goes against many things that he says in his papers and books. Okay. So the last point that I want to talk before concluding is about coherence and my reading of the concept of coherence and possible implication of it for quantum mechanics and how it's related to instrumentalism. So we said in De Finetti's theory, subjective probabilities are coherent degrees of beliefs. So obviously the nature of subjective probabilities depends on the nature of the concept of coherence that one uses. The betting decision theoretic framework was intended as framework for measuring probability and explicating the notion of coherence. De Finetti also used another framework which is called the loss function decision theoretic framework. He uses it later because he thought that it's superior in some sense and actually better for measurements. And but never mind. I mean, it's like it's not so important. The analysis of De Finetti notion of coherence is a key in understanding his theory of probability. And my argument is that different interpretation of this notion actually give rise to different theories. So it's really important, I mean, to get right what he says about coherence. Now, the main views are the following. There is one view that De Finetti's notion of coherence is in effect equivalent to the logician notion of consistency. And that Hausen argue and Dickey, Eaton, and Sutter argue, I mean, recently, that this is the view that one should understand. So coherence would be consistency. And sometimes they also appeal. I know that Colin Hausen appealed to the word in Italian, which could actually be understood either as coherence as consistency, again. So it doesn't determine. One has to use philosophy here to determine. Other hold that De Finetti's notion of coherence is not simply equivalent to the logician notion of consistency, but its extension of it to the logic of partial belief. So this is a weaker position, but it's still Both positions, I call them the consistency interpretation of coherence. And I think that they are not satisfactory because they overlook the fact that De Finetti attributed the great importance to the verifiability of events. And for him, probabilities are only of a verifiable events. So coherence has to be related to this idea of verifiability. And that's what I'm going to talk about now briefly. So De Finetti says, in general terms, it will always be a question of examining if and in which sense a statement really constitutes an event, permitting in a more or less realistic acceptable form and in unique way the verification of whether it is true or false. Then he says A and B are events, observable, but it is not possible to observe both of them, and therefore it is not possible to call the product A, B an event, observable. Now, De Finetti is not anti-realist about events, but events in the context of probability theory. That's what he's talking about. So events in the context of his subjective theory of probability have to be verifiable. Now, he acknowledged that verifiability is a notion that is often vague and elusive, and he thought that it's necessary to recognize that there are various degrees and shades of meaning attached to it. So that's a kind of problematic and soft part in his theory, and he took a pragmatic point of view, like it's really contextual. I mean, what kind of verification, a concept of verification, how strict, and the quality. I mean, and obviously also if whether something is verified or not depends on your beliefs, the theories that you have, and so on. So it's not that he was anti-realist about events, he's anti-realist about probabilities. But he thinks that, first of all, he assigned, as we said, the great importance to measurements of probabilities, and the prospects of adequate measurements of unverifiable events are dim. Think about how to verify the probability that people, assign in unverifiable events. We'll get back to it in a second. He also was influenced by positivism, and he was worried, as we saw, that if the notion of event would not be related to the notion of verifiability, then we might use, concepts that are meaningless. It's again, the influence of positivism. But, and here I think is the most important actually, these reasons are important, but in my view, there is another reason that is much more important, for his philosophy of probability, why unverifiable events cannot have probabilities. It is because it's difficult to make sense of the idea of coherent degrees of belief of unverifiable events. Remember, probabilities is coherent degrees of belief. If we cannot make sense of the notion of coherence in the case of unverifiable event, then there cannot be probabilities. So this is clear in the betting decision theoretic framework. In this framework, degrees of belief are coherent if they are susceptible, if they are not susceptible, they are incoherent if they are susceptible to a Dutch book, a series of bets which one is bound to lose come what may. But the problem is that bets on events that are in principle unverifiable could never be concluded. If you cannot verify, you cannot know who won the bets and what was the results. And it's actually much more general. If you are instrumentalist, what you care is about consequences. If your consequences are not verifiable, it's not important for the instrumental value. So it's more general. The verifiability is important here because otherwise it's really impossible to explicate the notion of coherence. And that's obviously different from the notion of consistency, because consistency, you don't need, for consistency of proposition, you don't need to be able to verify whether they happen or not, whether they are true or not. So incoherent degrees of belief in unverifiable events, a la consistency interpretation of coherence, have no verifiable harmful consequences, and therefore radical subjectivists like De Finetti have no incentive to avoid such an incoherent degrees of belief. Suppose that it's impossible to verify whether God exists. And I bet now on probability 1.2 on that. I'm not going to pay. I'm not going to pay anything. I mean, so why not? I mean, if I like it. So more generally, that's the idea. I mean, if the consequences of your action, I mean, there are no consequences, I mean, to your action, to your choice. I mean, remember, it's an opinion, to your opinion. Then it doesn't constrain. The degrees of belief as coherence should constrain. So the idea that the betting decision theoretic framework could be used to explicate the notion of coherent degrees of belief collapses in the case of unverifiable events. And my argument is that whatever decision theoretic framework that is compatible with this theory would use, I mean, it would be the same. And one can show that it's the same with the loss function decision theoretic framework, although there is less obvious. So, so I think that one can generalize actually this this conclusion. Okay, so why is it so important? I mean, that coherence is like that. There are two important implications of this notion of coherence. First of all, I mean, you can see that this notion of coherence is weaker than the notion of consistency. And it has the following implication. First of all, it has implication for the relationship between degrees of belief and probabilities. It is common to say, and that's the anything goes, that any events can have probability, subjective probability. But for De Finetti, it's not true. For De Finetti, any event can have degrees of belief, a degree of belief, but not probability. Unverifiable events have no probabilities because the notion of coherence degree of belief doesn't exist. So, so it's actually, there are much fewer probabilities in the subjective theory of probability of De Finetti than people usually argue. The second implication is about the logical structure of probabilities, which is in a sense non-classical. So probability of jointly verifiable events are less constrained because of that. And here's why. I'm almost done. So for example, according to the standard interpretation of De Finetti, the following inequality always obtains. Probability of A plus probability of B minus the probability of the conjunction is equal or lower than 1 because it's the probability of A or B. And it has to be between 0 and 1. But for De Finetti, if A and B are not jointly verifiable, then this inequality doesn't actually hold for them. And you can think a lot about a lot of other. So all you can say about A and B that the probability of A is between 0 and 1, the probability of B is between 0 and 1, but this inequality doesn't constrain these probabilities. It gives you more freedom. So more generally, the structure of probabilities is non-classical. And now in scientific theories, there are unverifiable, they talk about unverifiable events, especially quantum mechanics. We know that because of the uncertainty principle, we have many properties that are jointly unverifiable. That means that in these cases, the inequalities, the probability constraint on these events would be weaker than is in classical probability theory. And one can actually consider it. That's something that I've done, I said in my MA and recently. Look actually at how, for instance, the Bell inequalities and the Bell theorem, how it fares, and in the context of, for instance, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment, with respect to De Finetti-like probabilities along these lines. And one can show that someone who follows De Finetti might have some advantages. I mean, can get away with certain things. Okay, so just to conclude, can I have another couple of minutes? Okay. So just to conclude, in discussion about instrumentalism, in discussion of instrumentalism, it's common to conflate the ontological status of theoretical statements with their instrumental values. So it's frequently argued that under instrumentalism, theories are bound to be ad hoc, capable at best of accommodating non-observable phenomena and incapable of making novel prediction. That's Silos, an influential book on scientific realism, for instance. The presupposition is the ontological status of theoretical statement determines their capacity to make novel prediction. Similarly, interpreting De Finetti, there is the tendency to conflate the ontological status of surjective probability with the way they are determined in the instrumental value. It is argued that the theory that in this theory probabilities are unconstrained and their instrumental value is questionable. And this view, again, is based on conflation of the ontological status with the way probability are determined and instrumental, and the prospect as instrumental value. Okay. So it's argued, if you don't have objective probability, then subjective probability would not be a good guide for action and for beliefs. This proposition, I think, is controversial, and it begs the question against De Finetti instrumentalism. It's essential for De Finetti that probabilities, subjective probability, can be a very good instrument, even though they don't exist in the world. So one has to separate the ontological status from what De Finetti insists is that the determination of the values of this probability have to be a rigorous inductive reasoning. And in contrast with the realist, you think that the fact that there's subjective probability is not going to influence. Now, the last thing that I want to say, sorry for taking so long. So De Finetti, remember, position is based on the assumption that our psycho-intuitive capacity, that when they're developed, can yield instrumental probabilities, subjective probabilities, so instrumental opinions, degrees of belief. And as I argue, the realists have to also agree with this presupposition. Now, in the realist instrumentalist debate, there is very little actually talk about the role of intuition. And my suggestion, it's interesting, would be to check whether the effectiveness of such capacities can be explained better under the realist. I think that considering theories like orthodox quantum mechanics that usually, considered instrumentalist, there is a big question there. And instrumentalists like De Finetti would argue that the instrumental success is due to our psycho-intuitive capacities and the regularities that exist in quantum phenomena. And I think it's the onus on the realist actually to argue that there is something else that explains, the success of quantum mechanics as an instrument, orthodox quantum mechanics. So, thank you.